in contemporary analytic philosophy, some philosophers have been developing certain positions which are considered to be fictionalist positions. A quick, this is something that really started to take off in the year 1980. There were two significant works published, one by Hartree Field called Science Without Numbers, and one by Bas van Fraassen called The Scientific Image. Hartree Field in that book tries to show that, here's the starting point, I'll try to be very brief. Quine says that if you want to figure out what your ontological commitments are, you need to look at your best theory. Whatever your best theory commits you to, you have to believe that those things actually exist. So the best theories we have going now are particle physics, let's say. He would agree. So you need to believe in quarks and electrons and other sort of subatomic particles. Quine would further say that because our theories in physics depend on mathematics, you have to believe in mathematical objects too. So Quine, the hard-nosed, scientific-minded theorist, leads us to a kind of Platonism about mathematical objects. We have to believe that sets exist. Sounds wacky to me, but so Hartree Field says, so Quine would be left with a world comprised of subatomic particles and sets. Right, so Hartree Field tries to go in there and say, you don't need the sets, you don't need sets. Because all that mathematics is doing for us is giving us shortcuts to the inferences that we could get just by doing science. So it's really just a kind of shortcut method. Bas van Fraassen kind of then talks about scientific theories. Do I need to believe the scientific theories? He said, no, you could just really think of scientific theories as adequate to the phenomenon. I don't even need to think of whatever's posited by the theory as literally true, but I could just think of them as adequate to they're adequate descriptions of the phenomena that appear. So from there's been a whole literature on fictionalism. Sainsbury defines fictionalism as something like it's an attempt to kind of minimize one's ontological commitments by stating that the posits of our theory are not necessarily true, but are just useful fictions, or that the statements made within a specific domain, say science or mathematics, don't need to be understood as literally true, they just need to be understood as useful fictions. And so Tom Tillemont, well, okay, the first person to bring this up in the context of Buddhism was Matilal, back in a publication from '85. So that's where you've probably seen this before. And Sideritz picks up on it, Jay, of course, and Tom Tillemont.
So one worry I have about the fictionalist account, especially where it's a fictionalist account of reasoning that we're talking about, is, and this seems to be confirmed by your reference to theories in talking about fictionalism, is that the model of a fiction or a theory suggests that this is something that it's open to us to adopt or not adopt. And the point about reasoning, it seems to me, is that that's not something we can choose not to adopt. That's something forced on us. Whether, as Jan suggested, we're agnostic about the sense in which it's forced on us, whether we give an evolutionary or neurological account of that, or say these are necessary truths or whatever. Whatever the case, it seems not to be open to us to not adopt reason.
Right, so I mean, others have raised that concern. They don't like the word. It's okay, pick another one, that's fine. I don't think there's anything particularly hinging on the use of the term fictionalism. Another term might be there's no fact of the matter-ism. Another term might be you have to talk in terms of a language games-ism, or that there are specific parameters to any domain of discourse-ism. But fictionalism is kind of neat, and that's what's been used, so I'm just kind of following standard practice there.
My objection is not so much to the term as to what I take to be the content of the proposal, and if the proposal is still the same,
Okay.
then you still, the problem doesn't follow from the word fiction, it follows from the model that's based on that understanding. So,
well, one could believe that the let's say that we're talking about mathematics, right? And that when it comes to the domain of mathematics, you can't just offer any theorem you want, right? Wasn't some sort of theorem recently proven? Didn't we bring, no? I saw that, I heard this story on NPR, one of, what is these? Yeah, one of those conjectures. Whose conjectures? Poincaré's conjectures. So it wasn't as if I could have sent in to whoever's doing the grading, like, did I solve one of Poincaré's conjectures? Couldn't have scribbled stuff and send it in and just like, oh, I'm a fictionalist, will you take this? So, right, that it would be accepted from within the practices of mathematics and from with the parameters of that discourse that yes, this is a solution to that conjecture, or no, this is not, right? So, I mean, there's nothing.
Except I'm not sure how well the example of math works, because we typically think of mathematical truths as discovered. That when a mathematical
Wittgenstein
truth,
would disagree, and fictionalists would disagree, that it's not necessarily a matter of discovery, it's a matter of what we're doing is we're constructing.
fictionalists would take these as good arguments that fictionalism is wrong.
Right, and a fictionalist would take it as a good argument that you're not being open to being convinced otherwise, right? So, so Yablo has maybe the most interesting things to say about this, and he's kind of talks about the development, let's say, of a mathematical theory, and what would account for our adding to a theory or developing a theory in this direction as opposed to that direction, let's say. And he'd say that your average run-of-the-mill Platonist would say that, well, we developed it this way because that's how it is, right? Because that's how abstract objects work. So all I'm doing is telling you like it is, right? It's that way. Whereas a fictionalist could say, no, it's not necessarily that way, but we're kind of developing mathematics in the same way that we develop theory of music or any other area, whatever, any other domain of discourse. We're developing it, but there still is a sense in which there is, there could be ways of developing a theory that seem much more reasonable than others, right? That there could be a correctness. There is a correctness to developing a theory one way or another, and there's different accounts to give of what that correctness means. That correctness might mean, Yablo says, a couple of things. One might be that it fits very well with our background ideas. So given all this other background theories that we already have, it just seems entirely clear that this is the correct way to go with the theory, rather than that. Another way to kind of develop or consider the correctness might be that, well, if we develop the theory in this direction, we're not going to be able to apply it to very much. Whereas if we develop a theory in that direction, we'll be able to apply it more.
So, if you're looking for bibliography, Sandy, you can obviously look at the philosophical material that's just been mentioned, but there also is a very rich discussion in literature about this topic, and an essay that you might want to take a look at is by Christopher Ricks, R-I-C-K-S, a literary critic of some distinction, an Oxford professor of poetry. The essay is called Fiction and the Matter of Fact. And his argument is that even in fiction, there have to be facts. And as if you're writing a fictional story about something that happened in the 1920s and you have someone walk out the front door and get into an Edsel, it's a mistake and doesn't belong in that fiction. And he elaborates somewhat the consequences of this idea, so it might actually be amusing to bring both of these areas of discourse together.
I tend to like fictionalism as an analysis of a lot of Madhyamaka discourse, but I don't like this extension of fictionalism because to kind of keep up Dan's assault, fictionalism is usually introduced as a way of avoiding ontological commitment granted the truth or the cogency of a particular theory. So for instance, in logic or in mathematics, I might opt for, say, a substitutional interpretation instead of a domain and satisfaction interpretation of my quantifiers, and say all that stuff that I'm quantifying over, just push it aside, just think about substitution, and don't take the existence of the thing seriously. So, you know, it's well known you can develop number theory with the substitutional interpretation of the quantifiers, and then I say, I'm just a plain fictionalist about numbers. I'm going to treat them as though they're real, but they're just characters in a story. Really all I care about is substitution instances of formulas. Now, part of what worries me is that it's easy when we start talking about fictionalism to lose the distinction between an attempt to reduce ontological commitment to entities that we implicitly quantify over, and the optionality or mandatoriness of a certain kind of discourse. So it's optional to commit yourself to numbers or sets, and we've got different models of quantification or different models of interpretation of our domain to allow us either to be committed or not committed. But it's not optional, I don't think, to commit ourselves to the arguments that might lead us to go one way or the other. And this is a point that Dan was making earlier and that I would make as well. And this is, I guess, coming back to where Sandy and I, put up the dukes. And that is that it strikes me that reason and a kind of commitment to some canon of truth and cogency is a kind of transcendental condition on being able to argue at all, including being able to argue for fictionalism, right? So you can't, this goes kind of to the export point, right? It might be that your argument is dreamed, and it might be that your argument is posed by the illusory man to another illusory man. But if the argument is cogent, it can be exported. So I'm not real happy with fictionalism about reason in the same way that I might be fictionalist about the entities towards which one might be committed in a rational discourse. It just doesn't strike me that you can give that much up.
I suppose what I would respond to that is with another question then. Are you saying that it's not optional whether or not someone could subscribe to reason? Because that does seem to me to be optional. Someone could be entirely irrational.
Go ahead, Jay.
And also from the perspective of an Arya and Nirvikalpa Jnana, is it not optional? They must subscribe to reason in that moment of being in a state of
I think
Nirvikalpa
the
Jnana?
moment you abandon reason, you join Sandy outside of the egg, squawking like a chicken.
Let me suggest possibly an alternative way of looking at what Nagarjuna is doing with reason. I think we all have come to some sort of agreement that there's something reasonable going on in Nagarjuna. There are arguments going on that are logical. But perhaps instead of thinking about it as universal reason, that we bring in these assumptions, and we're talking about Plato and Quine and God knows what, that it's basically a presidia. And back to the point that it's a debate tradition. Debate tradition starts, you have to agree on some basic axioms. One of the axioms that all these traditions who engage in debate agreed on is we all claim to be reasonable. So Nagarjuna doesn't have to make a claim, he doesn't even have to be committed to it. Everybody else is committed to it, and they're making claims. And I think that's what he means by, I have no pratijñā. I'm not going to come in here and throw more claims on the table. The room's already full of claims. But I'm going to examine, one by one, any of the claims you make, and let's see where they go. They're all going to unravel, all on their own, and I'll show you how. They're all unreasonable. And then it leads to exposing the presuppositions that you were talking about before. I agree with that side of it completely. But I don't think he's committed personally to reason. I don't think reason, aside from being a tool for exposing presuppositions, plays any role. There's no commitment there.